Welcome to today's event, Syrian Voices from the 2023 Earthquake, Emergency Responses and Long-Term Impact. It's good to see so many of you here in person, and I'm glad others of you have been able to join on the webinar online. I'm Bonnie Doherty. I'm the lecturer on law in the International Human Rights Clinic and director of the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative, which is part of the clinic. And I'll be moderating a conversation with 4 experts in which we'll address the effects specifically in Syria of the February 6th earthquake, a magnitude of 7.8, and we'll also examine the challenges of the response, which have been complicated by Syria's 12-year armed conflict and resulting mass displacement and humanitarian crisis. 2 of our panelists will share their eyewitness experiences from Syria, and 2 will provide their expertise on the international response. Before I introduce them, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative, the International Human Rights Clinic, the Middle East North African Law Student Association Program and Law and Society in the Muslim World. And 2 practical measures. First, the event will be recorded. And second, after a discussion, we'll open the floor to questions. For those in the room, you should raise your hand and wait for the microphone shows up. But if not, I'll repeat the questions for you. And those on the webinar can submit questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. So let me briefly introduce our 4 speakers before we start our conversation. Obviously, there's a lot more I could say, but I'll give you brief introductions in the order that they'll first speak. Dr. Abdulkarim Ekzayez is a Syrian medical doctor, epidemiologist, and general secretary of the Syrian British Medical Society. He's done extensive research into public health impacts of conflict and is currently doing work at King's College London on strengthening health systems in conflict settings. He was training to be a neurosurgeon in 2013 when his residency was interrupted by the war in Syria, and he then joined Save the Children, where he led the health response until 2017. He's also supported rebuilding the health system in opposition-controlled areas of Syria using a bottom-up approach. Mohammed Assi lives in the countryside of Idlib. He's now 28 years old and was injured in 2013 when the Syrian government planes bombed a school in Umm al-Kubra with incendiary weapons. These weapons caused burns over 80% of his body. And he's been very helpful in working on the efforts to strengthen the law against incendiary weapons. He has since worked in the provision of humanitarian services with a number of volunteer teams and local non-governmental organizations in Northwest Syria. He will speak through interpretation, and I want to thank Susan Abayed for helping out with that. Ammar Al-Selmo is a graduate of the University of Aleppo and worked as an English teacher and volunteer first aid provider before joining the Syria Civil Defence, also known as the White Helmets, in April 2013. He established White Helmet Center in Al-Safara and later Aleppo's Old City, and has since served in various positions in the organization, including as Aleppo Directorate Manager and a member of the Board of Directors. He's also joining us from Syria. And finally, Alexandra Tarzikhan. Alex grew up in Aleppo, Syria, and has worked in refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and Greece. She's now a refugee rights advocate and founder of the Refugee social media platform, which is aimed at sharing stories about the cause. She has over 5 years experience working in human rights advocacy, humanitarian operations, and global health with a focus on forced displacement, conflict-affected settings, and climate change. She's also legal advisor for the MENA region with the ABA Center for Human Rights in DC. So I now want to turn it over to our experts, who should be the focus of this discussion. And first, I'll start with you, Dr. Abdulkarim, with a sort of background question. What was the humanitarian situation in Northwest Syria before the earthquake? And what were the pre-existing challenges with aid delivery?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you for shedding a light on this important topic on the earthquake in northwest of Syria, because the focus has been, especially in the first, let's say, week after the earthquake, the focus has been on southern Turkey, which was, hugely impacted by the earthquake. But then the area of northwest of Syria received less attention, and I think this might be mainly because having no governmental representation of this area, and that's why it is important to differentiate within northwest of Syria between two areas of control in relevance to your question. So the first area, which is under opposition control, and the other one under the Assad regime control, under Damascus government. And most of the areas affected by the earthquake were under the opposition control, although there were some areas, for example, Aleppo city or Hama city, under the regime control also were affected. But the majority of the impact struck the opposition controlled areas. And this area has been, suffering from 12 years of the conflict. And because this area has been the last stronghold for opposition forces, the area witnessed the majority of attacks by the Syrian regime and their allies, destroying most of the civilian infrastructure in the area. We're talking about residential buildings or hospitals, health facilities, bakeries, schools. Most of these facilities were attacked, regularly by the Syrian regime and their allies. The Physicians for Human Rights, as of November last year, they documented 630 attacks on health facilities in opposition health areas mainly, and about 70 or 80% of these attacks took place in the opposition controlled areas in northwest of Syria. So the infrastructure in this area was fragile because of the conflict itself. The other reality in this area is about population density, and most of this population are internally displaced persons. And here the area we have about 4.5 million population. About 70 to 80% of them are internally displaced, and the area received a lot of displacements from different areas in Syria, because whenever Assad take over any of the opposition controlled areas in any part of the country, there will be waves of displacement arriving to northwest of Syria, and those people are vulnerable in terms of lacking the basic livelihood, and also in terms of suffering from several displacement throughout the last few years. And lastly, about the services in this area, the area relies heavily on the humanitarian cross-border response, which is described to be the lifeline of this area. So the area since 2014 has been receiving cross-border response from Turkey, led by the UN agencies and other international and national organizations. And this was under a resolution by the Security Council, which was in July 2014, allowing the UN agencies and their partners to deliver aid across the border. Unfortunately, the status of this cross-border humanitarian response was unstable in the last few years because of the veto of the Russians and the Chinese. In 2019, the Russians vetoed a resolution to deliver aid across the border in northwest and northeast of Syria, and they instead agreed to have this resolution only for 6 months and only for one crossing point, which is Bab al-Hawa from Turkey into northwest of Syria. So before the earthquake, the reliability of the cross-border response was under question. And after the earthquake, the border was closed for about 2.5 days. The only crossing point for humanitarian aid was closed for 2.5 days, which affected massively the emergency response in this area. So in a nutshell, the area was fragile, the infrastructure was weak, the population were vulnerable, and the last thing they really needed was a natural disaster at such scale.
Thank you very much. And that gives a sense of the sort of dire situation even before the earthquake. Mohammed, I know you lived through the February 6th earthquake. And first of all, I want to express my concern for you and your family, and I hope you've stayed as safe as possible under the circumstances. Can you tell us what you personally experienced on the day of the earthquake?
محمد، أعلم أنك عشت زلزال 6 فبراير، وآمل أن تكون أنت وعائلتك بأمان قدر ما الإمكان في ظل هذه الظروف. هل يمكنك أن تخبرنا ما عشت هذاك اليوم وما عشت في وقت الزلزال؟
اوكي. بداية مرحبا. يعطيكم العافية جميعا. يوم الزلزال كان فينا نوصفه كأنه يوم القيامة.
Thank you all, and hello. I would like to describe the day of the earthquake as if it was the judgment day.
تمام. في البداية لما حدث الزلزال كان أغلب العائلات في بيوتها إنه حدث في ساعات الفجر الأولى. أدى هذا الأمر إنه صار أعداد الضحايا كبيرة كتير تحت الأنقاض. كنت نايم أنا وعائلتي فبلش البيت يهز فينا.
So most of the people during this time, the earthquake hit in the early dawn hours in the morning and around 4 a.m. Most people were already in their house sleeping. So most people were affected from this earthquake. Me and my family were in the house sleeping during this time when we started feeling the house shaking.
أبي كان خلينا نقول هو معاق، عنده بتر في الإجر، وأمي كبيرة بالعمر. هذا طبعا بعد ما تعرضنا لقصف أيضا ثاني بأورام الكبرى، تعرض أبي لبتر قدمه من قبل نظام الأسد. القصف كان في هاي اللحظة أنا قلت إنه ليش بدي أعيش لوحدي، أهرب أنجو بحياتي لوحدي، لازم خلاص خليني أضل مع عائلتي مع أهلي، يا منموت سوا يا منعيش سوا.
Okay, so my dad is already disabled. He has lost his leg from previous Assad shelling, and my mom is an older lady. So once the house started shaking, I thought to myself, why should I escape just by myself and then have to live alone? I might as well just stay here. And if we all live together. If we die, we all die together.
انتظرنا لحتى خلاص الزلزال الأول. خرجنا من المنزل، حملت أبي أنا وأخي وهربنا. كنا تحت المطر في الشارع. نهارا صار هطولات مطرية شديدة. بقينا تقريبا للساعة 9 الصبح تحت المطر. بالصدمة الأولى كنا ما متوقعين إنه يكون صار انهيارات أبنية في المنطقة بشكل كبير، أو صار ضحايا بشكل كبير. العالم كلها كانت في الشارع خايفة إنه ترجع بيوتها.
Yes, so once the first earthquake stopped, my brother and I carried my father and we went down to the streets. And at the streets, we found most of the people from the neighborhood were all sitting outside. And it was raining, and I sat outside with my family until around 8 o'clock in the morning. And at first, I didn't imagine the destruction that this earthquake had created. We couldn't imagine the number of victims that were caused by this earthquake.
بعدين بلشت توصل المناشدات من قبل الدفاع المدني ومن قبل الأهالي إنه في أعداد كبيرة من الأبنية المهدمة في مدن كاملة سويت بالأرض، محتاجين لتبرع بالدم، محتاجين لآليات تساعد بهذا الأمر. بعد ما اطمأنينا إنه هدت الموجة الزلزالية قليلا، إنه الهزات الارتدادية اللي ممكن تجي هي خفيفة نوعا ما، رجعنا للبيت. ولكن خلينا نقول إنه رجعنا للبيت بشكل خائف، إنه كنا مستعدين في أي لحظة للخروج منه. خلينا نقول إنه صدمة كبيرة. أبي تعرض لمرض صفار أو رهاب من أثر الزلزال.
Yes. So at first, like I said, we weren't aware of the level of destruction that the earthquake caused. After a couple hours, we started receiving messages and news from news outlets and also from social media saying that from the White Helmet specifically about the level of destruction. We saw that there's entire cities that were reduced to rubble, and they were asking for blood donations. After staying out for a couple more hours and sort of waiting out the aftershocks of the event, we decided to hesitantly return home. We returned home, but again, very, very hesitantly. And we were sort of expecting at any moment that we were going to pack up our things and run again. again, it caused such an emotional shock, and my dad suffered from multiple anxiety attacks because of this.
تمام. بعدين بلشنا نساعد فرق الدفاع المدني والجمعيات المحلية بانتشار الضحايا. شفت كثير من الجثث أمام عيوني كيفها بتطلع وهي متعرضة للهرس، وشفنا كثير من المعجزات اللي صارت بسوريا وبتركيا. إخراج عدد كبير من الناجين كانوا بوضع جيد، وعدد ثاني من الناجين اللي خرجوا كانت إصاباتهم شديدة. إلى الآن هن عم بيعانوا بالمشافي السورية بنقص حاد بالمشافي بسوريا، وخصوصا في شمال غرب سوريا المنطقة المقيمين فيها.
So once images and videos started circulating on social media, we started seeing again the number of victims that were caused by this earthquake. But similar to seeing the number of victims, we also saw miracle stories as well. We saw people being removed from the rubble after hours or days of being stuck. And we also saw the sort of the hardship of the medical attention that a lot of these victims required, and the destruction that was specifically in northwest Syria, which is where I am at.
يعني فيكم تخيلوا انه منطقة هي بالاساس منكوبة، معتمدة خلينا نقول 80% على المساعدات الانسانية والمساعدات الاممية لحتى تقدر تقوم على اجريها. الشعب اكثره تحت خط الفقر. بالاضافة لذلك المشافي اكثر مشافي ممولة من الامم المتحدة والمنظمات الدولية، وتعرضت لهي الكارثة العظيمة. يعني تركيا كدولة اقتصادية قوية وصلت للحظات شعرت فيها بالعجز أمام الكارثة اللي أصابتها، فما بالكم بشمال غرب سوريا.
So as you can imagine, Northwest Syria has already suffered from multiple hardships. It is already a region that is depending on UN agencies and also international organizations for aid. About 80% of the population in Northwest Syria lives below the poverty line. So you can only imagine this compounded with the effects of the earthquake, the results that this would have caused.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. I know you've already endured great suffering through the as a result of incendiary weapons, and it's heartbreaking to think what you and your family have suffered as a result of the recent tragedy. So thank you for sharing that difficult story. Ammar, could you tell us about the Syria Civil Defence's response in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, and what kind of challenges you've been facing in addressing that?
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be part of this. Actually, as my friend Abdulkarim said, there is no good or bad time for earthquake, but the earthquake came at the worst time ever, where we were facing the cholera pandemic, also the snowstorm, storm after storm. So the population, the people was tired, the infrastructure was weak, and also we ourselves, the White Helmets and other humanitarian organizations, were facing a critical financial situation. Before the earthquake, just before the earthquake, we forced to close out many centers. Many tens of vehicles were need repair without because they were breaking out. So the earthquake came at the worst time ever in this area. At the beginning of the first hours of the earthquake, I remember we were disappointed. We were like paralyzed to meet and to face all the mountain of rubble. This is the first time, like it like a big bomb hit all the area. So this is the first time for us to deal with this number of rubble. We used to deal with rubble during the 12 years, but neighborhood. I remember in Aleppo, the city where Russian launched a military campaign. It was similar, but in scale, it was big scale in this time. So we declared a state of emergency. We asked the international community, the UN, every humanitarian organization to deliver rescue teams, because our number is not enough, is not sufficient to deal with all that scale of destruction. more than 60 communities, people under the rubble. We were hearing their voices all the time, people asking us a lot of call from the people to deal with all that at the same time. So we were facing the time to save lives. But if aid, if equipment, if heavy vehicles, if search and rescue teams arrived at the time, things would be different. The future of those under the rubble would be different. So the community, the people around the world who helped. So the state, the international or the state system failed the Syrian people, but the people system, the people around the world who respond to save Syrian, and the people who help also to save the Syrian. We thank all the people around the world who donate, who advocate, and raise our voices to shed the light on the situation here. We saw teams, international rescue teams in Turkey, in Damascus, but we did not see any teams inside Syria. So the earthquake bus the border, but the teams, international team, did not come to this area. So we were able to save more than 3,000 lives from under the rubble during the fifth day. But unfortunately, many people died because we came too late to them. So this is the first week of response. After the first week, we lose the hope. We lost the hope to find any survival under the rubble. As time passed, the hope and opportunity to find people diminished. And we were able, after the second week, to recover all the dead body from under the rubble and bury them.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work that the White Helmets have done. It's deeply concerning about the limitations of the international response, but also inspiring to think of the work of your group and other, as you said, the people, individual people that have made a difference in this situation. Alex, turning to you, you've worked specifically with the refugee population, and I was wondering if you could speak to the problems they face in particular and what their needs are at this point.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone who helped organize this important discussion and for really including Syrian voices on this panel. So when it comes to the needs of refugees, I think it's important just to note that the areas that were most impacted by this earthquake were areas that were closest to the Syrian-Turkish border. And so we have needs of Syrian refugees who are in Turkey, but also needs of the internally displaced persons in Syria, as Abdulkarim mentioned. And both of these communities are now being displaced for a second, third, or fourth time since the start of the war began. And so when it comes to the needs of Syrian refugees specifically, it's important to note that Turkey continues to host the largest number of refugees worldwide. Since the start of the civil war in 2011, about 3.6 million people had fled from Syria to Turkey, according to the UN Refugee Agency. And it's important to note that this number represents only the number of the registered refugees only. So I suspect that the figures are much higher. Half of these refugees, so about half of this 3.6 million figure, were living in areas that were close to the earthquake epicenter, and now live in a region with destroyed buildings, destroyed hospitals, and roads. And so we have the immediate needs, obviously, when it comes to food, shelter, housing, heating, because of the cold winter weathers. We have, with food supplies and basic services that are stretched, and anti-refugee sentiments that are running high. Many Syrians feel increasingly unwelcomed, and the president Erdogan is under political pressure to put Turks first as the presidential elections approach later this year. So on top of the immediate needs, we have discrimination that is being felt by the Syrian community, which is coming both from the Turkish population and also the authorities in Gaziantep and Hatay, which are among the top provinces for Syrian residents. There are accounts from several Syrians saying that they were recent targets of hate speech, also that were affected by the earthquakes and competitions for government aid. And then there have also been accounts of challenges which include restrictions on coming and going from certain refugee camps, like the one in Nizib. You have the immediate needs, which Ammar talked about, and also the mental health needs, significant levels of trauma brought on by many years of war, on top of seeing family members and tens of thousands of lost lives, leaving this population more vulnerable than ever. And then lastly, we have the economic impacts. So the area affected in Turkey here generated almost 10% of the GDP in Turkey and 9% of its exports. And so at some point, when we start focusing on the second phase of this crisis and really start thinking about reconstruction, I think it'll be really important to consider how to best integrate refugees into these regional reconstruction plans. Because before this month, many had found work, they had their own sources of accommodation, and now are left homeless. And so it'll be really important to try and find ways to ensure that the Turkish government is held accountable to the needs of refugees, and that they're really at the forefront and remain, considered as we think of their response to this crisis.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks not only for raising some of the issues for refugees and internally displaced persons, but also some of the breadth of the concerns, the physical, the psychological, socioeconomic, which are faced by any person affected by the earthquake or the armed conflict in Syria. Mohammed, I wanted to turn back to you, and I was wondering, you talked a lot about how you were affected by the earthquake on the day of the earthquake. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your situation today, 3 weeks later, and a week after another earthquake hit the region. How's your family doing today, and what are your concerns going forward?
محمد، ما هو وضع اليوم بسوريا 3 أسابيع بعد الزلزال الأول وأسبوع بعد الزلزال التالي؟
اوكي بالوضع خلينا نقول شمال غرب سوريا بالكامل أصبحت منطقة منكوبة. كثير من العائلات حاليا خايفة ترجع لبيوتها. أعداد كبيرة من البيوت بعد إشراف الفرق الهندسية أعلنت منازل غير صالحة للسكن أو منازل تحتاج إعادة ترميم.
So now I would say that Northwest Syria is in complete rubble, not just when it comes to infrastructure, but also the civilians and the people living there are scared and terrified to return home. The infrastructure has been destroyed, so a lot of the buildings need to be rebuilt and the people need to be rehoused.
صار في نقص عدد كبير من المواد الغذائية الأساسية بسوريا. عدد كبير من خلينا نقول المنظمات سحبت كميات كبيرة من الأسواق بدون دخول كميات جديدة من المعابر أو مساعدات إنسانية بشكل كافي للمنطقة من قبل الأمم المتحدة أو المنظمات الدولية الثانية.
There's also a large depletion in terms of food and food supplies. When the earthquake hit, a lot of the NGOs and the international organizations had bought out a lot of the food that was located in the different stores without sort of replenishing that supply through international aid or international supply.
هذا الأمر بسبب إنه الأمم المتحدة تأخرت كتير بطرح المواد الغذائية وبعض المواد الثانية هي عن طريق المعبر، والكميات اللي دخلت خلينا نقول صغيرة بشكل نسبي على كمية الكارثة الكبيرة، أدى لنقص المواد الغذائية الأساسية من الأسواق وارتفاع أسعارها.
So this could be attributed to the delay in the United Nations resupplying the food that was taken out through the different international borders, and even the food supply that is coming in is not enough to sort of address the need in the region. And because of this, the prices have spiked as well.
كما أنه أعداد كبيرة لحد الآن من المتضررين من الزلزال ما حصلوا على أي مساعدات إنسانية ما قدمت لهم. أنا شخصيا عبر دائرة علاقاتي الضيقة
So a lot of people to this day, I mean, 3 weeks after the first major earthquake and a week after the subsequent earthquakes still have not received any sort of international aid or any aid in general. I have been able to receive at least some because of my own personal relationships within these humanitarian spaces.
عبر دائرة علاقاتي الضيقة يعني كثير عائلات إلى الآن عم بتنام بسياراتها خصوصا الأطفال في سوريا مجرد إنه يرجعوا على البيت وكانت هاي المنازل بأبنية طابقية عالية حتى لو ما حصل أي هزة ارتدادية أو كان الوضع آمن نوعا ما هن عم بصير عندهم حالات بكاء شديد حالات خوف شديد عم بيطلبوا من أهاليهم إنه أخرجوا من المنزل.
So a lot of people are still to this day sleeping in cars, and many of them with young children, not necessarily because of the destruction that happened in their buildings, but also because of the anxiety and the phobia that came afterwards.
لحد الآن مثل ما قلت في البداية إنه المساعدات جدا خفيفة جدا ضعيفة ما بتبشر بأي خير. خلينا نقول إنه نحن متعودين على الأمم المتحدة إنه هي تقدم مساعدات عاجلة في أي أزمة بتصيب المنطقة وبعدين ما نشوف أي برامج إنعاش أو إعادة أعمار في المنطقة.
So let's just say that the aid coming in now has been very, very weak at best. We are used to the United Nations coming in with international aid that tends to be immediate, but we do not see long-term reconstruction efforts on behalf of the United Nations within the region, or reconstruction efforts that include refugees or the affected population.
فيكم تخيلوا إنه منزل مؤلف من غرفتين أو خيمة واحدة بتسع على 3 أفراد أو 4 أفراد حاليا ممكن تلاقوا فيها 4 أو 5 عوائل.
So you can imagine a home that only has 2 rooms that is originally intended to only house 1 family now is housing 4 or 5 families.
طبعا ممكن تشوفوا انه في مبالغه بالكلام ولكن الحدود السوريه التركيه حاليا مفتوحه لاي وفد اممي بحب يزور المنطقه واي شخص اجنبي وفيكم اي شخص فيه يزور المنطقه ويتاكد من هذا الكلام على ارض الواقع.
So you might think that what I'm saying is an exaggeration or that I'm being hyperbolic, but as of now, the borders between Syria and Turkey are open, so I welcome any of you guys to come and to see the situation yourself.
فيني أكد على نقطة أليكس المنطقة بحاجة بشكل كبير لإعداد فرق دعم نفسي جديدة وخصوصا من أجل الأطفال وكبار العمر. يعني الوضع جدا مأساوي بالنسبة للأطفال. كثير من الأطفال عم ترفض بشكل قاطع إنه تدخل المنازل بعد ما شافته من الزلزال الأول والثاني.
So I just wanted to echo what Alex said earlier about the need for mental health efforts within the region, especially with younger children and older adults or people that are older in age. As of now, a lot of children are completely refusing to enter into any buildings and are just staying outside or in their cars.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I don't doubt your description at all, and I certainly don't think you're being hyperbolic. I think that you raised a number of important concerns. And building on that, Ammar, from the White Helmet's perspective, have you seen, you talked a little bit about this before, Mohammed's raised these issues, but what kinds of ongoing support do you need? And also looking forward, what kind of support do White Helmets or other aid groups need from the international community?
Yes. Life will continue, especially for the survival. Right now, the infrastructure damaged. Right now, there is, you can say, the sewage is distracted and damaged, and there is mixing with the water, drinking water. So there is the fear of environmental catastrophe. So rehabilitating the infrastructure is so important. The schools, most of the schools are damaged, so that's will entail children will not go to school when the school is open. Hospital, more than 57 hospitals partially damaged by the earthquake. So We need every possible support to rehabilitate the infrastructure inside Syria for the people to continue their life. More than 40,000 families are homeless. They need shelter, they need sanitation, they need wash. Those tend to evicted quickly. Right now, there is no access to wash or sanitation. They need sanitation and wash. So life will continue. Also, what Mohammed speak about is the people who survive from the earthquake need care. More than 12,000 injuries need to be need care, need doctors, need field hospital. Right now, there is no access to Turkey. So, Turkey, before the earthquake, were playing an important role during crisis in this area by transferring patients to the hospital, to the Turkish hospital. Right now, there is no way. It's blocked. So even people with chronic disease like dialysis, like cancer, right now people with cancer need their dose, need the medicine. So we need everything in this area right now. We fear of disease. As I said, the cholera before the earthquake, there was more than 500 infectious cases in this area. So we are in need of everything.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to turn to you, Kareem. Looking at some of the political ramifications of the armed conflict. In the aftermath of the earthquake, there's been some renewed debate about the sanctions that were imposed on Syria as a result of the Assad regime's conduct during the conflict. Both the US and the EU have eased some of the sanctions to facilitate aid delivery, but the Assad regime is using the earthquake to call for lifting sanctions entirely. I was wondering what your perspective was on these debates.
Really, thank you for this question. And I think the Assad regime, since the earthquake struck, has seen this disaster as an opportunity for them to ask for more normalization with a regime that committed a lot of what can be described as war crimes, including the use of chemical weapons, including mass human rights violations. And the narrative that the Syrian regime and their allies they've been trying to populate is that sanctions prevent humanitarian aid, which is not true. The sanctions, either the US sanctions or the EU, the UK, all of these sanctions have very clear exceptions for humanitarian and medical aid, which means that I do not think that sanctions by itself are the main reason behind hindering the response activities. It is quite the contrary. I think the Syrian regime itself played a role in hindering the response activities. In day 1 to day 3 after the earthquake, there was a cross-line convoy that was prepared to be sent from regime-held areas to the affected areas in northwest of Syria, but this convoy was stopped under the order by the governor of Aleppo, and they were waiting further confirmations from the palace in Damascus. So the narrative that the Syrian regime were trying to say that they are in Damascus are able to lead the emergency interventions, relying on cross-line delivery, which means aid being delivered to the affected areas in northwest of Syria, crossing the conflict line from the regime-held areas to opposition-held areas. I think the whole narrative is really politicized by the Syrian regime and their allies. Although now the US and the EU partners, they issued several general licensing to have exceptions for the humanitarian aid to go to the affected areas in the whole country, and also to grant some exceptions from the sanctions. I do not think the problem is the sanctions itself. It is the history of the Syrian regime by manipulating and politicizing the humanitarian aid. And there is a lot of research and investigations around the manipulation of aid by the Assad regime and their allies. So it is the issue of ensuring accountability when it comes to handing over aid resources to a regime like Assad regime. And that's why I think it is important to mention the issue of how to deliver aid to the different affected areas in Syria at this very important time. So we've been conducting some research over the last few years about the governance of the different entities within in Syria, within the different areas of control, and especially in the no-state areas in northwest of Syria. And I think the international community now should engage at a much lower level, at a decentralized lower level, with the humanitarian actors, with the civil society actors, and also with the technical quasi-governmental bodies like the White Helmets, who've been doing a great job in terms of filling the gaps that are generated by having no government in northwest of Syria. So I think any claim by the Damascus government that they are able to access or to cover the affected areas in northwest of Syria, I think these claims lack any credibility. And we've seen that actors like the White Helmets or the different Syrian NGOs on the ground, they are the ones who were the backbone of the humanitarian response over the last 12 years, and they are now the first responders. So I think the international community should identify a new modality on how to engage in a disaster relief response in areas affected by conflict where there is no government. I think this is the time to think about this. The White Helmets provided a good example of a quasi-governmental body or a technical body that has no political affiliation, but yet has the legitimacy from the ground and has the support from the community. And I think if we build on that model, I think this will ensure that aid is delivered to the affected population in the best manner in such contested conflict area.
Thanks, Kareem, not just for addressing the perspective of the sanctions question, but also for offering some alternative approaches to delivering the aid. And Alex, I want to ask you, some worry that the Assad regime is instrumentalizing, as Kareem discussed, the earthquake to regain a foothold on the international stage. How do you think the humanitarians can navigate this space to ensure that aid is not politicized? And how would you balance these concerns with the potential necessity to work with the regime to open cross-border routes and facilitate access to humanitarian aid in regime-held areas, including Aleppo?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's definitely a complex question with many layers. And I think I'm probably going to respond from more of a humanitarian slash human rights lawyer perspective. I think when it comes to the response, human rights must be at the heart of this crisis response. So we know that there's a record of past and ongoing human rights abuses in Syria that have occurred by the regime and others, and largely directed at the Syrian people, which poses several risks for humanitarian organizations, UN agencies, and donors. However, when it comes to humanitarian aid delivery, I think it's important to adopt a needs-based response rather than an access-based response, because as we have seen, this has been really inadequate at meeting the tremendous needs, both, whether it's in the Northwest area or it's in areas that were also affected, but that happen to be under the regime's control. I think aid should be conditioned on the respect for human rights. We need a response that's based on the needs of those most affected, and one that allows you to reach as many people as possible. And there are ways that this can be done. I know that the US has contributed around 185 million, I believe, dollars to both countries, in Turkey and Syria. But there's no oversight to how this money is going to be delivered or any kind of accountability mechanism. So we can start with that. We can start with conducting due diligence. Actors in Syria should conduct a full due diligence process and understand that there may be potential human rights risks and abuses may arise out of supporting certain projects. ensuring that programming, again, is based on the most urgent needs through a triaging process and without discrimination or political considerations, ensuring that the partners that are working, that it's a localized response, and that the parties that you're working with are not subject to human rights sanctions, or that there's no evidence that those actors have committed serious human rights abuses. And lastly, also operate transparently and ensure that, again, there's some kind of accountability mechanism, whether that's by having a standard human rights committee or a compliance committee that can oversee this operation, I think is key. Looking through applying it from a human rights lens and based on humanitarian principles.
Great, thank you, Alex. And it's a challenging situation to depoliticize, and I appreciate your suggestions for focusing on the human rights and victim-centered approach. So thank you very much for that. I want to, for those of you in the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box that's on your Zoom screen. I know students want to go to class in 5 or 10 minutes, so if there's any questions in the room, feel free to raise your hand now. That I will, yeah, go ahead there. And I don't know if you have any mics, so keep it short, and I will repeat it to the webinar group. So.
First, I want to say thank you so much for all of you taking time to talk with us today. I think as law students, we saw after the earthquake the international community to respond to the most vulnerable in Syria. And so I was just wondering, what do you guys think is like something worthwhile that we can do as law students to highlight the plight of Syrian refugees and international community? I guess more like long term, because I'm someone who's interested in like human rights work equally, but also then I'm seeing like how the UN and body family Syrians. So like what are other avenues I guess be more effective?
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to repeat the question. I'm sorry we don't have a mic, but basically the question was that first of all, thank you all for your comments. And the question was, as law students, what can be done? What can law students do to highlight the situations of Syrian refugees and IDPs over the long term and improve their situations? So any of you may chime in. Questions open. Anyone of the panelists? Feel free to just sort of speak up. Anyone wants to take that question?
Yeah, maybe I will go as maybe other panelists can think of an answer. I think the first thing that came to mind is definitely maybe donations to the organizations who are credible, but really about identifying the right channel, which is really important. And then I think it is about advocacy with the right political channels within the US, because as we explained, it is a contested conflict area. It's not like a normal natural disaster that happens in a country that has a legitimate government that can respond. We need an advocacy that aids from government and from the international community reach to the people, as Alex mentioned, on need spaces. And I think this will necessitate some work to be done by the governments in terms of understanding the political process within Syria, maybe activating even the political transition now. Because as you know, Syria, there was a resolution by the Security Council, which is 2254, on a political transition that is needed in Syria. And I think this is the time really to think about reactivating the political process and advocacy to activate this track, while to confront maybe the narrative by the Russians and the Syrian regime allies that to freeze this political transition issue and also start normalization process, which I think this will leave the victims of the earthquake really without the needed support on the long run, because we're not talking here about only the short-term needs in the first few weeks after the earthquake, but we talk about, a midterm to long-term needs that really require months and years to be addressed. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm happy to also add to that. I think also from a US kind of perspective, it's important, as Abdulkarim mentioned, to really continue to show interest in this issue, whether it's by meeting with your congressional representatives, writing to them to ensure really that Syria remains at the forefront of their minds for at least the next few months, and also for their recovery phase. This is going to take many, many months and many even years to come. Also, if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to Bonnie to connect us. Currently working on an initiative with a few colleagues and friends to try and find ways to continue this momentum on the crisis, because as media attention fades, that's really when people on the ground are going to need us the most, because funding is going to stop trickling in, and donations are going to stop trickling in. And I think it's important to really think of this more from a long-term perspective, and I'd be happy to chat on some ways that we can work together.
Thanks. And maybe I've got a question in the chat from someone on the webinar, and it's open to anybody, but maybe I'll turn to Mohammed or Ammar, some people on the ground. It says, thank you so much for the really powerful conversation, for your work and for your time. In these extraordinarily difficult circumstances, how do you stay motivated in your work and stay hopeful about a better future for Syria? So again, open to anybody, but particularly if Ammar or Mohammed would like to respond, but again, open to anybody. I want to chime in on that.
I'm not sure whether Mohammed needs maybe a translation for the question, just to engage Mohammed in the...
Susan?
Yes, I just translated the question to him, so he should be ready to answer.
Sure.
Thank you. Go ahead if you'd like.
ممكن تعيد الترجمة سوسة؟
كمان مرة حكى السؤال كان إنه في هذه الظروف الصعبة بعد الزلزال، كيف تبقى فيك الأمل وكيف تبقى فيك الحماسة لعملك في هذا المجال؟
اوكي. بالتأكيد ما فينا انه نحن نفقد الامل مهما صار، يعني مهما اشتدت حدة القصف من قبل نظام اسد والميليشيات الروسية والإيرانية المساندة له، او بالكوارث الطبيعية اللي ضربت المنطقة.
So first, we cannot lose hope with no matter what happens after, especially after Assad's regime has bombed and shelled most of the region. We were still remained hopeful.
بالتأكيد بالنهاية الحياة راح تستمر. اللي توفى الله يرحمه، واللي بقي عايش وحاليا مصاب نحن فينا نساعده عن طريق هاي المؤتمرات اللي ممكن نعقدها، نسلط الضوء عن قضيتنا في شمال غرب سوريا.
We cannot lose hope, no matter what happens. Whoever died, God bless them and may they rest in peace, and whoever is still alive, we help them by hosting events and panels such as this one.
اوكي. طبعا الناجين هم حاليا اللي بنحسن نحن نساعدهم، كان عن طريق تقديم المساعدات، او كان عن طريق التبرع لاي جهه تشوفوا مناسبه. طبعا الدفاع المدني السوري اللي هو الخوذ البيضاء بكل تاكيد قدم جهود جباره في المنطقه.
Yes, and we can remain involved through accepting donations or contributing financially to the Syrian Defense Fund or the White Helmets, who have been instrumental in providing aid to those affected.
ما فينا نحن نفقد الأمل، لأنه بالأخير مطالبنا لما خرجنا هي كانت تطبيق العدالة والكرامة وحرية الرأي في سوريا. من أجل هاي القضية مستعدين نحن نتحمل المصاعب اللي عم بتصير في المنطقة أجل توصيل رسالتنا الصحيحة.
Yes, so when we first went to the streets in the early 2000s, we were asking for human dignity and for respect, and this is a ask that we are still holding on to, and we are willing to sort of accept or accept these challenges that come to us because of this call and because of the call that we still hold on to.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Go ahead, Ammar.
This is so difficult question. We usually be asked by this question. When I started, I will speak personally. When I started the job in the White House in 2013, I thought that this is just for 2 weeks, 2 months, 1 year, not more than that. But because of the need on the ground, the scale of destruction, the scale of attacks, we continue the job, having the training, the equipment, blah blah blah, etc. But what motivates us to keep doing this job is when you get somebody from under the rubble alive. This is a moment of joy, victory, and happiness. This is. Can you imagine this moment when you working for 6 hours? For example, in one area, we were working in 6 hours. After 6 hours, we get a girl alive from under the rubble. So this is moment can motivate all the people around us, not only us, to keep doing this job, but also we face tragic incident, tragic story all the time too.
Thank you. Thank you, Ammar, and thank you, Mohammed, for your thoughtful responses. I think, fortunately, we're out of time. We put a couple, I don't have time to go through all the questions. There was one final question. There's another question about how to choose who to make donations to. The white helmets is certainly a very worthy cause. For those of you on campus, I encourage you to reach out to Manalsa, one of our co-sponsors, who has a list of other worthy organizations. We put in the chat, for those of you on the webinar, emails from myself. I don't have a list, but I can connect you with people who do, and Alex's email as well. And I'm sure other panelists would be willing to speak with you as well, and I can connect you. So thank you very much to those of you online. Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to you in the room. I appreciate panelists calling in from UK, from DC, and most importantly from Syria, and for all your hard work on this issue. Stay safe, and I hope that the situation in Syria will improve in the coming months, and hopefully as soon as possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.